Hey, everybody. I just wanted to thank you for tuning in, and I want to reiterate what Chris just said. Um, Look, I think we can kill this bill. And I think that we should not get too fancy with our thinking and our strategy. The objective here is not to improve this bill. It can't be improved. There's nothing that's worth doing inside of it. It raises the debt and it increases prices for everybody, all in the name of decreasing taxes for people making $4 million a year or more. So the first question, who loses their Medicaid in this bill? Look, the estimates I've seen are around 14 million people getting kicked off Medicaid. But the other thing I kind of want to point out here is that it has a big secondary effect. Even if you're not personally on Medicaid, it screws up the revenue stream, especially for rural hospitals and clinics. But any healthcare provider that has a payer mix, right? So a composition of payers that includes a big chunk of Medicaid, they're going to lose a big chunk of their revenue. And so if you're a big provider, you can probably sustain the cut. You just provide way less in the way of service to the community. But there are a bunch of, especially rural hospitals, that are always on the edge of shutting down anyway, and they will. So even if you're not on Medicaid, if you're in a place where the main hospital or clinic depends on Medicaid, you're also going to get screwed by this bill. And then the premium support problem is huge. A lot of people have no idea how much their individual healthcare plans are being subsidized. So a lot of people are going to pay like $500 more per individual per month. And if you're on a family plan, it's going to be 10 grand more a year. There's a bunch of us who remember how expensive healthcare was pre-Obamacare. And for as screwed up as our healthcare system remains, it is still a hell of a lot cheaper to go on the exchange and get some kind of plan. This will blow that up for another several million Americans. And so everybody loses for this bill and very few people benefit. Polly from Instagram, this is a question I ask myself like almost on the daily. Is it possible to fix what Elon and Doge and Trump have done to agencies? Of course it is. Now, how quickly that can be done, I think depends on the agency. There are some agencies that can snap back to, operating in the normal fashion. I think, this is a small example, so I don't want you to think I'm only tracking this, but the U.S. Institute for Peace was basically illegally shuttered. They brought in U.S. It was nuts. It was complete emerging autocracy stuff. They finally abided by the court order, and the U.S. Agency for Peace is starting to operate as normal. Now, they did find a bunch of drugs and drug paraphernalia all throughout the offices, so there's like a physical aspect of things being left in a shambles, but also administratively and money-wise. So I'm not like overly optimistic that it'll snap right back into, working very well. But I think we have to believe enough in the American experiment to believe that once we get back to a more normal political environment, that these agencies can be fixed. Now, I just want to add one thing. The Democratic Party cannot be the party of everything is fine and everything is already working fine. So some of these agencies actually do need to modernize and reform, and we should be in on that project and leading that project. And that is sort of in opposition to let's just go in and light the place on fire. People are smart enough to know the difference, right? Between someone who wants to actually reform agencies, modernize agencies, make them work for actual people, and someone who says, government is not working as well as it should be, so why don't we make it work even less well? So, but I do think we have to articulate that we understand things are not perfect as they were 6 months ago and commit ourselves to that kind of change, but lawful change, logical change, and a kind of an approach to things that understands that these are serious enterprises. They do serious things, and you can't light them on fire and expect them to recover. Well, please talk to us about what y'all will do to protect our government employees. One of the things that I promised myself after the second Trump inauguration is I wouldn't give you BS about where our powers are. And I actually think the tools to protect government employees are mostly in existing law. And you may or may not know that Trump has lost close to 96% of all lawsuits, and that includes a substantial portion of them that have to do with civil service and collective bargaining and other rights that our federal employees have. So most of what is happening is illegal already. We do not need a new law. We need the current law to be enforced. Okay, Katie from Instagram. Hi, Senator Schatz. How will this bill impact Native communities? It's mostly the Medicaid cuts that make me the most nervous for Native communities. But, Native communities, not everyone, but many are extremely sensitive to cuts in public services. So you may not know that, especially on tribal lands, the FBI is often the primary source of law enforcement and public safety and security. So that's an aspect, but mostly it's going to be Medicaid and what that does to rural hospitals, but in particular, Indian Health Service hospitals. Anna on Instagram, how do Republicans justify increasing our spending and deficit to fund inhumane deportations versus healthcare and food for Americans and the world through USAID? They don't even bother. I mean, let's be honest, they don't bother. They're not troubled by trying to be like consistent ideologically or intellectually. This whole enterprise is very simple. They are increasing your costs, right? Your healthcare costs, your grocery costs, your retail costs, your electricity costs, right? And what are they going to do with that money? Well, they need to find a pay for, which is a fancy way of saying they need money for the purpose of cutting taxes for the wealthiest corporations that have ever existed on planet Earth and people making more than $4 million a year. So I'm not going to make their arguments for them, but I'll also say they're not even really making their arguments themselves. They're just kind of shrugging their shoulders and lying about it. What are you most angry about on this bill? It is the Medicaid cuts. Well, okay. I know you said, what am I most angry about? I'll give you two things. It's the Medicaid cuts because I just know people on Medicaid and I visit rural hospitals and I know how much this is going to crush both individuals and the institutions that serve, some of the folks that need healthcare the most. But I think the cherry on top of the sundae that makes this the absolute worst is that this money is not to pay down the deficit. This money is not for some, we're not at war trying to fight fascism and we need to find revenue everywhere we can. This isn't to reform the system. This isn't to invest in education or try to buy down the debt. This is simply to cut taxes for people making more than $4 million. I just want to say we can win this thing. This last couple of days have been pretty rocky for the Republicans. And so I don't want you to give up hope. There are some instances where I don't think we're going to win, and all we can do is raise our voices and maybe sue and see what happens in the next election. This is not one of those times. We can actually win this damn thing. But this is the most important fight. Whatever it is that you care about, in addition to this, it is important to understand that as a strategic matter, the most important thing that we can all collectively focus on is getting the word out about how rotten this bill is. And the thing that's kind of alarming to me, in addition to the substance of the bill, is that like only 1 in 4 Americans actually understand how bad this bill is on the healthcare side, what it's going to do to Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act. Okay, I got a question from somebody on Facebook. Can you clarify why Dems can't filibuster this procedurally? I'm going to answer this as quickly as I can and try not to lose any viewers. The short version is this is a budget process that is one of the very few things you can do in the Senate that is subject to a bare majority vote. So regular legislation, you need 60 votes, but because this is a bill that either increases or decreases the deficit, and it certainly increases the deficit, but if it does anything to the deficit, then it is subject to this weird, ridiculous process called reconciliation. Frankly, we use that for the American Rescue Plan and for the Inflation Reduction Act, so it is available to the majority if they've got the votes. So we can't filibuster. What we really need is 4 Republicans in the House or 4 Republicans in the Senate to kill the bill. And the only way we get that is if those people are more afraid of their constituents electorally than they are of Donald Trump. Oh yeah, can you please debunk the myth that they're only cutting migrant Medicaid? The only way you think that this is only cutting migrant Medicaid, not really migrant, I think you mean people who are illegally in the country, is if you think 14 million people are on Medicaid who are not citizens of the United States. Like, that's not plausible at all. What they are trying to do is increase the administrative burden, the paperwork burden, to the point where people just kind of like cycle out of the system. These are eligible people who can't figure out the paperwork, right? They are trying to do this with Social Security as well, but this is clearly a cut to Medicaid, and it is going to shut down rural hospitals, shut down rural clinics, and cause many, many people to lose their health care overall. Next, we have Sue on Facebook. So in H.R. 1, what about the provision that rejects the authority of the courts to hold government officials in contempt when they violate court orders? This would apply to all temporary restraining orders, preliminary injunctions, or permanent ones that have ever been issued. Yeah, this is outrageous. This is nuts. It's so bad that even Republicans in the House who voted for it are now saying like, whoops, I didn't know it was in there. I think that's bullshit. But to your basic question is what's going to happen with that? That I am very confident will be removed by the parliamentarian. It is not eligible for a 50 vote threshold. That is definitely a 60 voter. So lots of things to be pissed off about. I think you can still be pissed about that the House of Representatives would actually vote for this on the Republican side unanimously. But I don't think you have to worry that this will become law. What should we be paying the most attention to on this? Look, I think, here's my advice. I think there's a lot of stuff that, pisses people off. Like some people are particularly outraged at a ban on regulating AI for the next 10 years. And obviously somebody just talked about withholding money for the enforcement of temporary restraining orders and other court orders. Like those are all things to be really pissed off about. But I think the best way to kill this bill is to focus on the Medicaid cuts, the nutrition assistance cuts, and where the money is going toward. And I'm telling you that of all the outrages, of all the things that you are pissed off about or worried about, that the thing that is most likely to kill this bill is this idea that they are raising prices on Americans on the healthcare side, on the grocery side, on the electricity side, in order to generate enough money to provide tax cuts for a bunch of people that most of us have never met. And so I think we need to have real discipline here as a party, sort of left, center left, leftist, everybody just talk about Medicaid cuts because it is unifying and it is by far the most compelling way to talk about this bill. In fact, there's so much crap in this bill that we could do ourselves a disservice where everyone picks their least favorite provision and then our message is muddled, right? And that's what they want. They are trying to flood the zone. So we have to say they're cutting your healthcare, they're raising your prices, and they are taking all the money out of your pocket and giving it to someone else. Is there anything that we can do to stop what's happening with the American people was the question. Yeah, we can kill this bill. We really can kill this bill. I'm not saying we're gonna kill this bill, but I am saying that it feels right now like it felt before the Affordable Care Act fight and before we won. It was one of those things where we were losing until we won, right? We did not think we had the votes. Even going into that evening, I was expecting that political parties, generally speaking, deliver for their presidents and that's how this was going to land. And that is not how this landed. And it wasn't, we tried we did everything. We fought like hell, and I thought we were pretty effective in that way. But when I say we, I'm not really talking about like me and Booker and Murphy. I'm talking about everybody in the world. The reason that the senior senator from Arizona, John McCain, went onto the floor and famously gave the thumbs down is because he was hearing from his constituents. And so if we're going to generate 4 no votes, it has to be through those constituents. There is no magic like speech I'm going to give or Facebook Live I'm going to do or a cable hit or email or tweet that's sort of like some dagger to this bill. The only way this thing falls is if politicians make the judgment that they are quite afraid of what's going to happen to their constituents. Oh, well, Miranda from Instagram, in all honesty, is there actually any hope the big budget bill will not pass? Look, I think this is one of the problems with the movement that I'm trying to help to solve, which is, I agree. If I thought we were just going to lose, then I would be talking about this mostly in the context of raising our voices or, politicians make choices and then they're accountable to the voters. We want to make this thing maximally unpopular so that they suffer, politically. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we still have a puncher's chance, probably not like a high likelihood, but not zero either, to kill this bill. So yes, there is actually a hope that this big I forgot what they call it, this crappy budget bill will not pass. And my view is the strategy is the same. Try to kill the bill. And if the bill is going to pass anyway, that we've done a ton of organizing and public communication and public education about how terrible this bill is, and then it flows right into, sort of plan B in our strategy. But plan A is to kill this thing. And in order to execute plan A, we actually have to believe in ourselves and each other, right? We can't just walk around going, oh, the Democrats are so flat-footed, I can't believe it, and they're flooding the zone, and they're just going to win on everything. That's not the way you win a battle. You have to actually believe you can win the battle and believe in your team. Flawed as it is, screwed up as it is, the last election was a total failure for us, but that doesn't mean we always lose. That doesn't mean we can't win this one. And part of it has to do with how much we believe in our ability for a very, very unpopular bill to become well-known and unpopular enough where people say, I'm in a swing district. This seems like a dumb idea for me. And that's what we've got to do. Janet on Facebook. What can be done about the people being taken off the streets, out of their homes, who are legally here? They're just rounding up anyone not caring who they are or if they have a right to be here. I think this is, I think there's a court aspect of this where we are prevailing. And I just don't want to gloss over that. But I also think physical presence, peaceful physical observation and presence and educating people as to what their rights are, it's really an important aspect of this. And so, the law enforcement officers are being called to do these law enforcement actions, ICE agents, the Homeland Security, investigations folks, the FBI, sometimes the Guard, sometimes local PDs. Like, they're not uniformly, rotten people or something. Like, they're just doing a job. And if they see community pushback, and again, I'm not talking about physically getting in the way of an operation, but if they see community observation, community pushback, if they see, even in Hawaii, we specifically are sort of like, look, we don't operate that way in the state of Hawaii. We're different here. We're kind to each other. You're free to enforce the law, and you're free, frankly, even to enforce the law more vigorously than you think the previous administration did. But there's a way to do this where you're not terrorizing people in schools and synagogues and churches and hospitals. And so my own judgment is that one gap is the nonprofit community, other churches, individual citizens in an organized, thoughtful, legal, peaceful way to observe this stuff and provide some kind of pushback to these actions. Because I think to the extent that these folks think they are not being observed, it's more likely that some, bad behavior occurs. Who do I have winning the NBA Finals? Thank you so much for this question. It's OKC in 5. I don't think it's that close. I wish it were closer because I'm now at the point in the sports year where we're getting into baseball, which is not my favorite thing, and then we got to wait for football. So I always, unless it's my team, which is the Detroit Pistons, which means it's been a long time, I always root for a 7-game finals just so I can watch more basketball.